Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 529. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, you ready to do this?
Yeah.
All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Leslie Bullock. Leslie, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
All right. So Leslie is a licensed psychotherapist in private practice in San Luis Obispo, California. She specializes in treating trauma. Her focus is the centrality of the mind-body connection and body-based approaches in trauma healing. Leslie is a certified trauma center, trauma-sensitive yoga facilitator, a trauma and resiliency model practitioner, and mindfulness meditation instructor. Paramount to her work with people is relationship-based in safety, authenticity, and integrity. Enough said there. Sounds good. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So before we get going here, Leslie, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're currently living.
Okay. Well, I was raised in Asia, different countries in Asia and in Hawaii. And as an adult, I spent 10 years in Thailand. And currently I live in the Central Coast near San Luis Obispo.
Okay. So, wow, number one. And what led you to all those amazing places?
Well, I lived in Asia because of my father's career. He was in the Foreign Service. And then we moved to Hawaii when I was 12. And I just, I learned some languages. And so as soon as I graduated from college, I went back.
Right.
And then I worked
Awesome.
in refugee camps in Thailand for 10 years. So.
Sounds awesome. All right. So, I was obviously reading through your bio and looking at your website, and as I do, just wondering how the heck you got into this field.
Right. Well, it was somewhat accidental, I guess, as much as anything is accidental. So I kind of think of it as this invisible trajectory that makes sense. And I think it goes back to in my early 20s, I worked in Thailand in the refugee camps, and I didn't, hadn't been graduate school yet. And I realized that I saw a lot of trauma, and, these were people who had escaped war and, had gone through a lot of suffering and lost a lot of people in their families. But I didn't know what it was, and couldn't put a name to it because I didn't really have the training in that. And then fast forward about 8 years to graduate school, and my all-time favorite class was a class in trauma. And I still wasn't sort of putting it together, wasn't leading anywhere. I wanted to go into social work. I'm a licensed social worker. And then I worked as a medical social worker in an emergency room. And again, you see lots of trauma. It was a children's hospital. So I saw, gunshot wounds, sexual assault, drug overdoses. And I would work mostly with the families, but it was a very limited way of working with people. It wasn't therapy. It was sort of putting out fires and helping people with resources. So again, I realized I was working with trauma. And then as I realized that I wanted to go into private practice, started as a generalist, depression, anxiety, relationship, communication problems. And what happened was I started to see a lot of women with severe sexual abuse histories. And I didn't ask for it, it just started happening. And I realized at that point, I started to realize this was 2006, so a while ago when I started private practice. And I started to see the limitations of talk therapy. I love talk therapy, but I started to see that we needed to go deeper into somatic work. When I watched my clients, sort of the collapse that can happen, disassociation, poor eye contact, that kind of thing. And I knew that I needed to learn more about trauma and how to work with people's bodies. So that's when I got really interested. And when I started to do all types of, more studies and every webinar and every summit that happened. But what really clinched it for me was more personal, as often happens for therapists. And that was in about, I think it was 2010. And I started myself to have some PTSD-like symptoms, not vicarious trauma, not secondary trauma, but it was relating to what was happening in my personal life, which I can go into if I need to. But I was having panic attacks, migraines, lots of anxiety, sleep disturbance, couldn't concentrate. And then it was like, what the heck's going on? And I realized this is something that was embedded in my body, had been there for a long time. I didn't ask for it, but then I knew this stuff is real. I didn't ask for this. What was going on inside of my body, I really needed to work on it myself. So that's a long-winded reply to how I got into trauma work, and I've never looked back because I'm just very passionate about it. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. So you said early on, that class was one of your favorites. Why was that?
I don't know. Well, I mean, one of the reasons I think was the professor. She had a lot of different people come in and speak about trauma. It wasn't just a rote lecture. We talked to people who worked with war veterans and sexual abuse survivors, and we had an EMDR person come in. So it was like a breadth of exposure to trauma healing modalities, and so that was exciting. But again, I enjoyed it, and then I sort of put trauma aside as that's not what I'm going to do right now. Yeah.
And what about the whole field of therapy? What drew you into that?
Well, I think, after I had done my time in the trenches, so they say, I worked in hospitals, inner city schools, I realized that my strengths were in working one-to-one with people.
Okay.
And that's when I had been doing my hours and working towards my license. But when I finally got my license, I said, I want to do therapy.
Right. So you said you started out as a generalist, and then you started hearing these women's, experiences. What was it like for you to begin to hear that and to recognize this as continued occurrences in a sense? You kept hearing these stories.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, what was it like for you to hear these women's stories and, okay, this woman's been a victim of sexual assault, and this one's been a victim of sexual assault.
In settings that are not private practice settings, in clinics or in schools, there is a tendency to detach more, or for me it was just you're present for the stories, but I did realize after a time that I would take them home with me and I would feel the impact of it, and it felt heavy. But I think the biggest frustration for me was I don't feel like I was making an impact in the way I wanted to. And again, it's a lot of just crisis work. And although, that's important, and it's important people with acute stress reaction to direct them in the right place, but it always felt unfinished, and like this wasn't enough. So everything was sort of on the surface when you're doing that kind of work. In schools, there's so many barriers to working with kids. But in terms of how it impacted me, I think that's what led me to thinking that I want to go deeper with this. I want to be able to take people deeper into their wounds and help them, to heal.
Yeah, that's a very interesting place to be when I think you realize that.
Yeah.
And so what did you do first? Okay, you realize, I need to go deeper in order to help these individuals. And this is a big question, because a lot of people listening are like, where do I start? What workshop do I take? Where do I go? How did you decide? And where did you go first in terms of your studies?
Well, so this was 2006, 2007 when this started happening. Bessel, Why to Keep the Score wasn't out yet, the seminal book about trauma. But Judith Herman's book, Trauma Recovery, that was my Bible for a while. I mean, it still is, in learning about how trauma affects the body and how to work with more implicit levels of trauma. So that was a go-to book, but also, there were trauma summits happening at the time. So I looked online for stuff. And I also I was working with a therapist at the time, not with my own trauma, but with sort of working through what I was hearing and feeling, because it was, it affects us as well.
Right.
So that was important to me. But nowadays, there's so many more resources. I mean, still not enough, but there's a lot more resources for people who want to go into trauma. I mean, I would suggest, any type of trauma webinar. There's tons of books. And I also, a different part of my story was I went into to yoga. I mean, I've been a yoga practitioner, but I became interested in using yoga in the therapy room. So I learned about a training called trauma sensitive yoga, that was a turning point for me, because it was such an excellent course, 300 hours, excellent course. And that's what really got me more deeply into somatic therapy.
So did that teach you to become a trauma instructor?
You mean a trauma?
Or yoga instructor, I'm sorry.
I had become a yoga instructor before that, as just a regular yoga teacher, and because yoga was part of my journey to help myself.
Right.
A huge part of it. When I started to experience PTSD symptoms. So after I became a yoga teacher, I didn't want to use it in a public setting. I wanted to use it in a therapy room, but I wanted it to be trauma informed. And again, this is the time when trauma informed wasn't yet really a buzzword.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found this course. So I would say that the trauma sensitive yoga class, again, was what really helped me. And I don't teach it in a public setting. I just use it in therapy. And so we don't, in trauma sensitive yoga, we don't use the word teach, we use the word facilitate in that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about, when you started, again, you said you were a generalist, and then you started getting more into trauma and understanding the importance of body-based work. How was that process for you? Here you were now, learning more about trauma and working with the body in the sense. Talk a little bit about that arc or that progression for you as a facilitator or therapist.
It felt really natural and organic. Just what I felt like I was meant to do that. And as I started doing it, and again, the somatic piece is critical. I mean, we all know as trauma therapists that, there has to be a somatic component to work with the deeply embedded wounds and constriction. And so when I started doing it, and when I started doing embodiment practices, it just felt really natural to me. I just wanted to learn more. And also, as we know in therapy, the most important part of the relationship is the connection, the social engagement and the safety that we felt with people. And so that became even more critical for me. Like I would, spend at least 3 or 4 sessions establishing safety with my client before we would go deeper. But I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but it just felt really natural to me and what I was meant to do. So sort of like a calling. I mean, that sounds a little dramatic, but it felt like that to me.
You've been doing this for a while, and I want to ask you about kind of an early clinical error in a sense. You're only one.
Oh boy, only one.
Right.
I give you more than one. Oh gosh, yeah. Well, the one that comes to mind, first of all, is someone who had a severe trauma history, sexual abuse in her childhood, but she had been abducted and and kept in a small space for many months. And it was our 3rd session. And again, sort of not the qualifying thing, but the underlying thing with most of my clinical errors is doing too much, too fast, too soon. And so anyway, this day she came in and she was already really hyper aroused. She was anxious, and I didn't know quite what was happening. And I had a small office at the time. And then she sat down. She was really, sort of constricted and fidgety, and she started to really panic, have a panic attack. We weren't talking about anything particularly triggering. And so I immediately went into, okay, let's let's fix this right away. So I had her, I placed her hand on her heart and feel her heart. I invited her to feel her heart and to do some deep breaths. Well, I had forgotten that for her, one of her triggering experiences was hearing her heartbeat in a situation she'd been. And the deep breathing made it worse. And her panic escalated. And she said, I have to get out of here, out of the room. And so, my error was, again, with having her feel her heart and go into this deep breathing was not what she needed at the moment. What she needed was probably just me being present with her in that space and not doing too much. So we ended up going out of the room and walking and until she was able to regulate a little more.
Right.
That was what I really remember because it's sort of like we often rush into trying to fix things and make it right. And I think that's what happened. Yeah.
When did you realize that, that wasn't necessarily the job, in a sense, to rush in and fix things and,
Probably after that. And that was sort of early on. Again, I've been doing this for a long time, 15 years. I think I started to, slow down. I mean, slowing down is what we always need to do in the therapy room, right? I remember and reading this, and I think a lot of therapists have heard this, the WAIT acronym. Why am I talking? So people like put it up in the room. And so that became a sort of a useful acronym for me, like, okay, checking with myself, why am I talking right now?
Right.
And the first task is to be present in a safe way and to listen. And also, as I learned more and more about somatic work and did some sensory motor trainings, Pat Ogden's model, was really listening more for the somatic narrative more than the verbal narrative. And that requires a much, I think, more fine-tuned sense of awareness rather than just, okay, what are we going to jump into today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. In fact, I've never heard that WAIT.
Oh, really?
Acronym.
Yeah.
And I love that because I could have certainly benefited from that.
Yeah.
But what you're also talking about here too is what I'm also getting is, it's also inviting the therapist, is it not, to really kind of honor themselves and have that self-trust that being is valuable, and just being present is enough. And that's not always easy. It wasn't for me.
Right. Yeah. I think that's the very first thing, unless you have that presence or able to be with someone, people know it, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, they know if you're present. And I generally have, I'm pretty good about that, but, sometimes it depends on how we're feeling when we come in, what kind of a harried morning we've had, or if we had an argument with, somebody the day before. But I think, again, that's why, our own tuning into our own soma, our own somatic experience, and having our own sort of self-care practices essential for trauma. Well, for all therapy, but for trauma, I mean, if we start to feel dysregulated, then things don't go as well.
Let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Leslie Bullock, and her website is lesliebullocklcsw.com. That's Leslie, LeslieBullockLCSW.com. I'll have that linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So let's talk about what's going on for you currently. So you're currently working in private practice. Okay. Are you doing strictly virtual stuff now, or?
No, I'm doing a combination of now. Started seeing people in person, which I like much more than people. Yeah.
And I was going through your website prior. You have courses on there and a lot of stuff. Let's talk a little bit about what your offerings are for people.
Well, prior to COVID, I was doing trauma-sensitive yoga, some classes of 6 or 7 people. I'm not doing that right now. I hope to get that started again, because that's not something that I would do virtually. For me, it wasn't comfortable. So I might start that up again. The current thing that I have going on is a workshop that's called Trauma Awareness. trauma awareness and embodiment, and it's happening on April 2nd. It's an all-day Zoom event, and I'm covering all aspects of trauma, everything that I feel like I've learned in the past 12 years.
Is it for therapists and
Yes,
survivors or
yes.
both? Okay.
No, not particularly for survivors. I mean, anybody can join, but it's for continuing education units for LMFTs and LCSWs.
Okay.
And yeah, so it covers social and systemic trauma as well as individual interpersonal trauma, because I don't think we can talk about trauma without talking about systemic trauma in our society as well. So covering both of those areas, covering elements of trauma-informed mental health, some core elements of trauma healing, and I'm interspersing it with embodiment practices. So that's sort of the experiential part of the day, is when I'll be guiding people in brief. When I say brief, I mean 10 seconds to 5 minutes of practice of learning how to be in our bodies. And these are tools that people then can take with them back to their clients.
Okay, awesome. So I can get a link from you. We'll have it linked up at the show notes page. Okay. And we can direct people to your website as well. So awesome. Now, is this geared towards newer therapists or more experienced therapists or what? Anyone?
Anyone who's interested in trauma. And even if you're not a trauma therapist, I mean, I think that learning these practices of how to pause, slow down, connect with feeling rather than thinking, there's the ways that we perceive the world generally. Most of the time we're in our thinking mind, in our cortex. And the practices that I use a lot in my therapy, and that anybody can use, is how can we shift in a very flexible way from thinking to feeling in our body. And even doing that for a minute can be regulated.
I love that.
Anybody would benefit.
Okay. So let's go a little further with that. So how can we shift from kind of thinking to kind of being in our feeling? Go a little deeper with that. What do you mean by that? What would that look like?
So again, we don't want to go into too much neuroscience, but we've got our frontal cortex, we've got our limbic system, and then we have our reptilian brain, which is instinctive, which is really a big part of trauma responses. So most of the time we're in our thinking brain, which is essential, it's analytical, intellectual. But in order to feel sensations in our body, or even emotions, particularly emotions, it's important to pause and drop awareness. I literally said sort of a vertical dropping awareness into someplace in the body. It might be the heart, the belly, the shoulders, and body scans do that kind of thing. But it's just shifting awareness. We can do it right now. And I guide people to do that. And sometimes it's a global awareness of the body, sometimes it's specific places. I often use gestures and ways to contact the body that helps to contain it. But it's really a shift of awareness from thinking to feeling sensations in the body. Staying with the body. That's what Pat Ogden always says. Stay with the body. Stay with the body. That's not an interpretive experience. It's not an analytical experience.
It has to be embodied. It has to be experienced,
right.
Lived.
And it's not a skill that we learn. It's not a skill we learn in graduate school. That's why I love yoga so much, because yoga is all about being in our bodies.
Leslie, what would you say to, the newer therapists out there, or even therapists who've had some experience, but really haven't, or are just starting to become trauma informed, to get on their trauma informed journey? What would you say to those people?
That's a great question. I guess I would start with reading a book. If it's there's so many great books out there about trauma right now, I know you're going to get to this question later, so I'll probably save my favorite book for later. But there's Bessel van der Kolk's Body Keeps a Score, Trauma and Recovery. There's Babette Rothschild's The Body Remembers. I guess I would start by reading a book. There's a lot of books about trauma and dissociation, and seeing, gleaning some information from that. There's tons of conferences and webinars and summits online all the time. So I guess get educated first, to get some background and some psychoeducation about it. Polyvagal theory, very, very important to understand in trauma work. So getting some education about that, and then you're starting to apply some of the principles and that knowledge into your work.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, let's get to that go-to book recommendation. What do you have for us?
My current favorite is My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem.
Awesome. In fact, that's the one I'm currently reading right now, which is why is that your favorite? What about it?
Because it addresses more than individual interpersonal trauma. It addresses societal trauma, racism, xenophobia, sexism. It addresses the problem of trauma in our society, that we're basically living in a traumatized society. And so I appreciate his breadth of that. And then he gets to the embodiment stuff, which is my passion, and he gives concrete embodiment exercises and practices, some of which I use all the time. So it's personal. So all those elements just make it a really great read.
Awesome. All right, we'll have that linked up also. My Grandmother's Hands, here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. All right, Leslie, awesome talking to you. You've been doing this for a while. I can feel the passion emanating from you in this.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll be in touch.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.